listening to Tea with Tolkien, a podcast for the Hobbit at heart. Join us as we chat about the works and faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to carry a little piece of Middle-earth into our own daily lives. So before we get started, for those of you who don't know or maybe don't follow Dr. Ordway or know too much about her, I just wanted to read a little bit of an introduction. Dr. Holly Ordway is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute and Visiting Professor of Apologetics at Houston Christian University. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and is a subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies. She is the author of several books, including Tolkien's Modern Reading, and her latest book is what we're here to discuss tonight, which is called Tolkien's Faith, A Spiritual Biography. Now, the last time we spoke, Holly, you were preparing for your book launch on September 2nd, and the book has been out for a few months now. So I was kind of just curious to hear how that experience has been. Like, how has the book been received?
Well, first of all, let me just sort of say thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I didn't want to kind of jump in before the audio was ready, but I'm so glad that you've been able to make this work. So it's only been only a few months since the book launched September 2nd, but it feels like longer because there's been so much enthusiasm for it. I've done a lot of lectures. It's been very warmly received, and I'm very grateful. You know, when I wrote this book, I was aware that there was filling a gap because there is no other book that treats Tolkien's spiritual life fully. I mean, it doesn't exist. There is none. And I knew that there was a gap that needed to be filled. But what I didn't know until the book actually came out was that it turns out there are a lot of other people who also felt that there was a gap, and they've been receiving it really with appreciation really warmly. And that goes across the spectrum, not just, Catholics, Christians of all denominations and folks who are not Christian or interested in that at all, but they recognize this is an important part of Tolkien's life, and so they're interested. And this has been really encouraging. And then, of course, it was simply marvelous to be able to launch it in the UK. Caitlin, you were there at the Birmingham Oratory, which, the Birmingham Oratory where Tolkien grew up. And I had the great privilege of being invited to do the book launch there, the official first book launch of Tolkien's Faith at the Birmingham Oratory, with almost the entire population of fathers in attendance. And it was really moving to be able to speak to them. And it was neat. Afterwards, one of the fathers came up to me and said that in hearing about Tolkien's life at the Oratory and the way that the Oratorians and St. Philip Neri had influenced his spirituality, he said that it actually helped them at the Oratory kind of see their spirituality, their faith, their mission in a new light and in an encouraging light. And so that was also a neat realization that Tolkien, he can bring people into deeper knowledge of the faith and to, beyond just what's interesting about his own life.
That's been something that I really appreciated about the book, that it doesn't have it's not set out to evangelize anyone. It's not really, you're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're just telling them a story of Tolkien's life. And that story can speak for itself. So it can appeal to anyone, regardless of their belief, whether they are Catholic or not. I think there's something in the book for everyone.
Yeah, and that's something that I did very, very intentionally, because there are a lot of books about Tolkien that are excellent books, but they're very deliberately aimed at an audience that already accepts, the Christian faith. And it's very hard for anybody who is not a believer to access that. Or, for instance, somebody who's a Christian but not a Catholic. I remember, one of the, in a way, sparking points of this book was years before. I was talking to a colleague at Houston Baptist University, which is Houston Christian University, used to be called Houston Baptist University. They changed the name. Anyway, a Baptist colleague, and he's a Tolkien fan. And he was saying to me, we were just standing in the hallway chatting before our graduation. And he said, I read this article about the Marian elements in The Lord of the Rings. And I just wish the author had stopped to tell me what those were. Like, what does it mean to have a Marian influence? He wasn't upset or anything. He just was a bit baffled because he needed someone to explain what that was. And I thought that's really often the case with folks, whether they're non-Catholics or non-Christians. you just need someone to explain what these things are without the pressure of also trying to convince them, you should believe this. And that's what I very deliberately set out to do with Tolkien's faith, to just share it. Just let it be what it is.
Right. And I think you did a good job balancing that tone. We've been reading your book over the last couple of weeks. It's our January book club. And along the way, our users have been submitting questions for you for this Q&A. So I thought it would be fun if we kind of just get started with these questions and kind of see where the conversation goes along the way. Our first question is, what got you interested in this topic specifically, and how did the book overall come about?
Oh, well, I began being interested in this when I was doing the research for Tolkien's Modern Reading, which is the book that I published before this one. And that book took 10 years to write for a variety of reasons. And in the process of doing that book, I looked at every possible interview that Tolkien ever did, any interview with any of his family, his friends, his students, his colleagues, you name it. Because I was trying to track down any possible evidence of what he had read. But of course, I turned up lots of other interesting things along the way. And one of the things that kept recurring in all of these interviews, some of them extremely obscure, was how serious he took his faith, how this was really important to him at the very depth of his being. And I mean, I knew he was a Catholic, and a serious Catholic, but I had quite naturally sort of imbibed the impression I got, from Humphrey Carpenter and from other biographers working from him, that, yeah, he was a Catholic, but it wasn't really the major thing in his life. I mean, one of his biographers, Raymond Edwards, even puts all of Tolkien's Catholic faith in an appendix. I mean, literally compartmentalizes it. And it was striking to realize, oh, okay, there's a lot more here than people have really taken account of. And then I began to realize too that, Carpenter in his biography acknowledges that Tolkien's a serious Catholic. He's quite straightforward about it, which is excellent. This is good. But he doesn't understand Tolkien's Catholicism, because he was himself actually even an atheist when he was writing the biography, and from an Anglican background, quite naturally didn't understand it. And he makes it out to be primarily an emotional attachment to his mother. But the more that I learned about his faith, and the more that I had come to know about English Catholicism in that cultural environment, the more I realized that just wasn't enough. That wasn't an adequate explanation of how his faith was important to him. So all of that was kind of bubbling around in the background of my imagination. But it hadn't kind of come to the boil yet. And then my good friend Michael Ward, when I was talking to him, and I said, I wonder what I should write for my next book. And he said, well, there is no book about Tolkien's faith. I know, I've tried to find one. And there's 50th anniversary coming up. Why don't you write a book for that? And I thought, oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's great timing.
It was perfect timing. It was providential in many respects. So that was the background, and then just a little push that tipped me over to say, right, I'm going to take on this project and I'm going to do it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we're glad that you did. So another question that one of our members submitted was, are there any interesting stories that you gathered that didn't make the book? Anything kind of like maybe that stood out in your mind, but that just didn't make the cut for some reason?
I don't know. It was a very full 2 years of writing, and
Oh yeah.
My brain filled up and I wrote the book. And yes, there were things that didn't make the cut, but I managed to pack in quite a lot. So I can't bring to mind at the moment the things that didn't. Sorry.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Another question that we've got, in the book, you mentioned Mabel Tolkien found it worthwhile to attend a high Anglican church, reflecting the beliefs of the Oxford movement. Can you discuss this movement? Did it influence Ronald, and did it influence C.S. Lewis? So, sorry, that's kind of a big question.
Yeah, quite. So try to be concise. Oxford movement was basically in 19th century English Christianity. It was an attempt by Anglicans to bring more sort of Catholic teaching, and a return to, the apostolic tradition into the Church of England, which has become sort of more sort of evangelically minded, low church. So the high church movement was the attempt to be more Catholic. And so you got also the Anglo-Catholic movement was really also moved to bring in more, more of the liturgical traditions that are associated with Catholicism, but also doctrinally to bring back a lot of these things as well, and to try somehow to fit them into the doctrinal commitments of the Church of England. And so that's its own big issue. As to how it influenced Lewis, I don't know. Michael Ward would know. He's the Lewis scholar. I don't know. In terms of Tolkien, I think the key influence is Newman, because John Henry Newman, was one of the pivotal figures of the Oxford movement. He was one of the founding members as an Anglican, but he kept going up, and he ended up crossing the Tiber and becoming a Catholic. Some of his friends also did, and some of his friends, like Pusey, remained in the Church of England. And Newman was a huge influence on Tolkien. He founded the Birmingham Oratory, which is where Tolkien grew up. Father Francis Morgan, who was Tolkien's guardian, and second father, had been one of Newman's personal secretaries, and also the whole community of fathers they'd known Newman. So Tolkien grew up in an atmosphere very much shaped in every way by Newman's vision. And I also think, and this is one of the things that I explored in Tolkien's faith, the question, why did Mabel become a Catholic, is a question I've been asked many times. And part of this book was an attempt to answer that question without seeing more of her personal letters, of which unfortunately not many survive. Many of them were destroyed. Most of them were destroyed. We can't know for sure. But the fact that she did make the point of going to a more high church Anglican church, I think indicates this is an attraction to the Oxford movement principles. She ends up taking instruction as a Catholic at St. Anne's, Alchester Street in Birmingham, which was actually the mission church originally of the Birmingham Oratorians. Newman and his Oratorians, first established that. It was kind of an outpost for his teaching. So again, this is the next step, Oxford movement into Catholicism. So I think Mabel's path was very much a path of being a serious Anglican Christian, taking that faith seriously and having it draw her into the Oxford movement principles. And then I think that led her to Newman and the Oratorians, and that led her into the Catholic Church and therefore her children as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really cool. Thank you for providing that perspective for everyone, and kind of like the way that everything kind of works together along the way throughout their story. The next question that we have is from Matt, and he says, at the end of the first chapter, you say Tolkien was not a saint, at least not in the idealized sense that we usually picture saints as. He wants to know, what do you think of the cause for Tolkien's canonization?
Well, this is another, actually a big question, but phrased very concisely. First, I think it's important to be accurate. There is no cause for his canonization. There are people who would like there to be a cause.
Okay.
Not exactly the same thing.
Right.
No cause has been formally opened. That's just useful to know. This is an interesting question about his canonization, because there's really two different questions here. One is, do we think that he is actually enjoying the beatific vision? In other words, is he, a saint, as opposed to, still working his way through purgatory? And the other is, if so, should he be, honored, raised to the altars? I actually think, personally, it's my conviction that he is a saint, that he is enjoying the beatific vision. I think he demonstrates heroic virtue in his life. I just sort of personally have that conviction. That said, I think it's just as well that we don't actually pursue canonization. And that has to do with his place in the wider world, because, well, there's a couple of things here. One is that, for non-Catholics and non-Christians, they don't understand what saints mean. Like, they think it means that we either worship him or that we are idealizing him, that we're saying he was perfect in every possible way. Now, we know that that's not what sainthood means. That they're, saints who had very imperfect lives, but that's not how it's perceived in the wider culture. And I think that if we did have a Saint J.R.R. Tolkien, it would be very off-putting to a lot of people who honestly need to get to know him. They would benefit from getting to know him. I think it would be a barrier for people to explore his faith, because they would think that we are putting a kind of, 100% perfect label on him. And that just is a bit off-putting. And I think it would make it harder for people to engage. And I think he's doing a lot of good. I wouldn't want to hinder that. And I think there's a kind of humility in that, if Tolkien is in heaven, he is. He doesn't need to be recognized as being there. He'd rather do good, without being recognized. And the other aspect is sort of addressing, more to the Catholic community. I think it can be a useful kind of self-reflection, say, why do we want him to be canonized? Is it because we really do think that he is a saint? Or is it because we want to kind of get the stamp of approval for our favorite author, because we just love him so much, we want him to be canonized? And I think it's really helpful to consider which of those two things it might be, and recognize that we can love an author a lot, but he doesn't need to be canonized. And I think the key question is, do we ask him to intercede for us in our prayers? Because if we do, then that's actually an indication that he has a genuine developing cult. And that's a real reason to seek his canonization. But if we say, well, I want to be a saint, but I don't actually ask for his intercession, that would be like, well, we don't really need to just give him the badge of honor, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. I also feel like there's a tendency in the kind of Catholic sphere to, by emphasizing Tolkien's Catholicism, it kind of creates the impression that we feel like we own him, and that we're kind of putting him in a little box and saying, no, Tolkien is only for Catholics and you can't have him. And I don't really, at least especially for Tea with Tolkien, like I don't ever want to give anyone that impression. Like Tolkien is for everyone. And so I tend to agree with you in terms of all of that.
Yeah, and that's such a great point about the kind of possessiveness that we can have. And it's a possessiveness that comes out of affection. Like, he's our guy, right? But yeah, we need to be really careful about that. I completely agree.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so moving on to another question. Oh, this is a fun one. This one is from Regina. She says, you mentioned multiple times that Tolkien translated prayers into Quenya, and I'm interested in knowing if there is a published book that has these translations. She mentioned she wasn't sure if she saw anything like that in your bibliography. So I was curious if you could address that.
Yes. And the answer is like getting into the fringes of super nerddom. So yes, it is in the bibliography, because it is in, well, I'll hold this up. I don't know if people can see it, in volumes such as the Collected Vinyar Tengwar.
You just had that with you.
I saw the question on your list.
Okay.
Off my shelf. I didn't have it really handy, but I thought, well, I saw it in the list. I'll pull it out.
Perfect.
So this is a journal that is about his languages, and so in a couple of the issues, they pull out the bits that he translated of the prayers, and so that's where you would find it. But there's no other like published book for a wider audience or a more popular audience. And I think this actually I lets me bring up kind of an important point. And I mentioned this in Tolkien's Faith, but just sort of in passing. I think it's important to note that as far as I've been able to tell, Tolkien did not ever pray in Elvish.
That's a good question to answer.
Yeah, because he didn't. As far as I can tell, he never did. What he did was he used prayers that were very familiar and meaningful to him as the texts that he used when he was practicing his Elvish script, for instance, or when he was practicing like figuring out like translations. I mean, like when he was writing out different Elvish scripts, I mean, he uses a lot of familiar prayers, but he also has like God Save the King, and the Walrus and the Carpenter from Alice in Wonderland. So he uses things that he knows by heart, and he knows a lot of prayers by heart, and they're meaningful to him. And so that's something that comes out. But in that instance, he's primarily using them as texts that provide him with things he can copy. And then when it comes to his translations, he spends a lot of time working out the translations. I mean, there's like several different versions of the Lord's Prayer, for instance. But here, the point is that he's developing his languages and he's trying to figure out, how would I express theological concepts in these languages? And so he turns to familiar prayers to articulate that, and he tests out like different ways, like, okay, well, what's the right way that I would put this, and how do I need to invent the right Elvish to convey this concept? So there are experiments in translation as he's working out his languages, but most of them are, or many of them at any rate, are not complete. He doesn't necessarily have a full, like there's not a full litany of Loretto, for instance. Or there's not a full Te Deum. There's parts of it. And so even though he has most of the pieces, for instance, for an Elvish rosary, there is no indication whatsoever that he ever thought about doing an Elvish rosary or ever prayed in Elvish.
I kind of get the impression that it was less of a devotional thing and more of like his process, like kind of like you said, these are things that he knows by heart. So it makes sense for him to want to kind of practice his translation by working through these things. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's really interesting about it is not that they're not devotional practices, but they show how fully integrated his prayer life was to him, that it was the thing that bubbled up most easily. That's something about how deeply he'd internalized these prayers.
Yeah, I love that. Our next question is from Matt again. He says, can you tell us more about how this book was researched and how it came about? And I know you talked a little bit about this, but is there anything that you would like to share about the process?
Yeah, I mean, it was an amazing book to write. I did it in just 2 years. After 10 years in Tolkien's Modern Reading, this felt like how can I do this so quickly? I'd done a lot of the prep work, a lot of the research for that. I already had a lot of material from doing Tolkien's Modern Reading, but it basically was my entire life for 2 years. The most demanding project I've ever done, and it was marvelous. It was simply marvelous. But one of the things that I did was to go really deeply into the historical cultural context, because I realized I have a kind of unique position as a Tolkien scholar, because, well, first of all, there aren't that many Tolkien scholars who are Christians. Of the ones who are Christians, there are not many that are Catholics. And then of the people of the Tolkien scholars, hardly any, like most of them are Americans. And okay, I am myself an American, but I spend about a quarter of the year in England every year and have done for like 12, 15 years. I spend 3 months of the year in the very place that Tolkien spent most of his life, and I've made many visits to Birmingham and whatnot. So I know Oxford and I know English Catholic life in a participatory way, and that's something that I realized I could bring to the table. And I had again, this was a sort of a leading up to it in a year or two before I started writing the book. Another kind of contributing element was that I had gone to confession and then to Mass at the Oxford Oratory. Now, the Oxford Oratory was not the oratory when Tolkien was there, but it's just the Church of St. Aloysius. The oratory came later, but the spirituality is the same as Birmingham Oratory. And so I went to confession at Mass at the oratory, and I walked out and I said to myself, wow, the oratory and spirituality, it's so Tolkienian. And then I kind of did a double take and I thought, wait, it's the other way around. It's Tolkien who has a very oratorian spirituality. And that was one of the light bulb moments for this whole book, which, as you know from reading it, has a lot about the influence of the oratory of St. Philip Neri. And that insight came from being able to live a kind of a shared experience with Tolkien in Oxford, in the life of English Catholic worship. And I'm really grateful to have had that opportunity, and realizing that was kind of the thread that I thought, okay, well, here's an insight that I gained from, in effect, just worshiping where Tolkien worshipped in his same context. Let me keep doing that. And so I really delved into what was the context like, did a lot of research on English Catholic culture, English Catholic life, very specifically, what was it like to be a Catholic in Birmingham in 1900? What was it like to be a Catholic in Leeds in 1920? What was it like to be a Catholic in Oxford in the 1930s and onward? And I did, went to Oxfordshire History Center, looked at all sorts of primary sources, pamphlets, it really rolling up my sleeves. And it gave me a much better picture of the environment. And that, I think, is something that has not been done for any other Tolkien biography. And it really enriched my understanding of his life of faith and his life in general.
That was something that I really appreciated about the book, because as an American Catholic, I really didn't have very much knowledge about what it was like to be an English Catholic, especially in the time that Tolkien was growing up. And so putting all of that into context in the beginning of the book, I think laid a really strong foundation for the whole rest of the discussion. And it really made me appreciate how much more, especially his mother, had to sacrifice, like how big of a risk it was for her to convert. It was something I had never heard before. So I really appreciated that.
Well, I'm glad to hear you appreciated it, because I thought to myself, how would anyone know this? How would you know it if you hadn't been immersed in English Catholic culture?
Right.
I should tell people about this. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and it really made me truly admire Mabel so much more, because you see the real cost that she paid. And now it makes a lot more sense for Tolkien to say that she was a martyr, because that particular statement can come across a little bit as an exaggeration. But if you think about it, all she had to do was to say, no, I'll walk away from the Catholic faith. I'll go back to being an Anglican. And she would have, had financial support. She would have had emotional, familial support. She would have, they would have been no longer in poverty, no longer stressed. And she just didn't do it. She said, no, I'm going to stick with this faith, no matter what it costs me. And it cost her a lot.
So moving kind of in a different direction, Chris asked, what are your thoughts on the Tolkien movie that came out? I think it was 2019.
I thought it was terrible. I thought it was absolutely terrible. I saw it in the theater and I was devastated, because here is a feature film being made about my favorite author, and I was checking my watch because I was bored. This disaster of a film. It wasn't even terrible in an interesting way. It was just meh, in my view.
To me, it felt like it could have been a good coming of age story for any generic English 18-year-old man. It didn't have that like Tolkienian quality to it. It told an interesting story of like someone being swept up in war and kind of experiencing that, but it didn't feel like it really went much further than that to me.
No, and they didn't really understand Tolkien. And I mean, part of it, they really didn't understand the story. I mean, apart from the fact that they have almost nothing about his faith in there. And I recall reading, apparently Stephen Colbert, like in an interview, asked him, why didn't you put his faith in there? And the director said, well, we couldn't figure out how to make it interesting. And I thought to myself, well, that's lame. That's your job to make it interesting. And like, oh, he wrote books. Well, I can't figure out how to make that more. We'll just leave out that he was an author. Like,
yeah.
I mean, it couldn't have taken much. Show him praying the rosary, which he did pray the rosary in English. I mean, in Latin, presumably not. Show him going to a church, etc. I mean, at least they showed Father Francis as being a reasonably sympathetic figure, but they didn't get it. And even, the story itself, they took a lot of liberties with his relationship with Edith. And in every way, they made it more boring. Actual story of his love for her, the 3-year separation. He contacts her to find out she's engaged to somebody else, that kind of thing. Like they made it less interesting than his actual life. Like what the heck?
Yeah, there was a lot of drama there that they kind of just glossed over. I was really bummed out by that film, honestly. And I had bought tickets to see it on the premiere. I was so excited, and it was just
And they get his character wrong all the way through. Like one of the things that really annoyed me is at the end, you see him, writing the Hobbit, and it gives the impression, the closing bit, that he's spending his time writing his book, and his children are missing him because, oh, dad's up writing the book, and we wish we could see him, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it was actually the opposite. He was a devoted family man. He spent all this time with his children, and he wrote in the wee hours of the morning when his kids were asleep. It was the opposite of the picture that they gave. And they just went straight for the stereotype, the artist who neglects his family to pursue his art.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the opposite. That was not how Tolkien lived. He was devoted to his family and devoted to spending time with his kids. And he paid a cost of that, and that he would put all these late nights, doing his writing after he had fulfilled all his family responsibilities. So again, they just got him wrong, and they got him wrong in a very stereotyped and boring way. Well, then someone has to make another film. Maybe one of your team with Tolkien people is actually a screenwriter. I'm happy to be a consultant.
That'd be awesome. That'd be really cool. I would love someday to see a more comprehensive story told, and kind of one that actually frames him in a more accurate light. That would be really cool.
Just a side note in that, I don't know if you've seen The Most Reluctant Convert, the C.S. Lewis film.
No, I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
It's excellent. It's really good.
Oh, okay. That's great to hear.
It's not perfect. It's a little bit too much like a stage play. I think it's not quite filmish enough, but it's really well done. But one of the things that's good about it, amongst many, is that Tolkien has an actual role in it, not a big role, but they show him presenting apologetics arguments that end up influencing Tolkien's view, of the liar, lunatic, lord argument.
Mm-hmm.
And that I was really impressed, because they knew what they were doing, because most people don't think of Tolkien as being interested in apologetics. And like, to have him presenting the liar, lunatic, lord argument to Lewis during Lewis's sort of, agnostic phase might be surprising, but it's absolutely accurate. That's actually something that Tolkien did argue in his own way, and he did help Lewis to become a Christian through these arguments and conversations. So kudos to the Most Reluctant Convert folks, because they showed us a Tolkien that was a bit surprising and is 100% accurate to his actual relationship with Lewis.
That's awesome. I'm sure everyone in the chat will be really excited to hear that. That's a great endorsement coming from you. That actually works out pretty well, because our next question is about Lewis. So the Rudy librarian has asked, did Tolkien and Lewis ever attend service with each other? And then kind of following that up, did they ever work through their theological differences within their friendship? Is there anything that you kind of discovered about this as you were writing your book?
I've done a couple chapters on Lewis, and so I do delve pretty deeply into their relationship and their differences. So as to whether they went to any services, I don't know if Lewis ever went to a Catholic service. I simply don't know. That's not a no. That's I don't know. I know that I've heard. Oh, here's a bit that didn't go into the book, in answer to one of your other questions.
Mm-hmm.
I heard an anecdote that Tolkien had gone to Evensong with Lewis sometime, was not able to track down the primary source reference for it, so I didn't include it, because I'm pretty scrupulous about tracking all my sources. But that is the kind of thing that it would have been perfectly legitimate for him to do, a little bit not typical for Catholics at the time, but certainly possible. But we know one Anglican service that he went to with Lewis, and that was Lewis's funeral. He did go to Lewis's funeral, and also to Charles Williams's funeral, also an Anglican, and to others. And this is worth noting, because in that day, English Catholic culture, although it was allowed to go to a non-Catholic's funeral or other service, it was still a little bit debatable. Like, there would have been Catholics who would have thought badly of Tolkien for doing that. So this is worth pointing out, because Tolkien was very ecumenically minded. He really was living out the church's understanding of ecumenism as it was fully articulated in Vatican II. He was living that out decades before, at a time when it would have put him, not in the mainstream of necessarily a lot of his fellow sort of more traditionalist Catholics. And he was very clear that there is one church, founded by our Lord. But he was also very clear that folks like Lewis were Christians, were his brothers in Christ. That's crystal clear from everything he said, how he related to them, what he wrote. And he was comfortable with that. I mean, he had theological discussions. He tried to convince people when he could. Like he tried to convince his friend Raymond Chambers, an Anglican, to become a Catholic. Basically saying, I quote this extensively in Tolkien's Faith, basically, come on in, the water's fine. And he had lots of conversations, about the faith with Lewis. But ultimately, I mean, I think he had confidence that his friend Lewis would follow the light as he knew it. And so he was okay with that. Where they had tensions was, I think, where Tolkien perceived that Lewis was expressing, his ulterior tendencies, his anti-Catholic tendencies inherited from his Ulster upbringing. And that did upset Tolkien, sometimes greatly at different points. But Lewis was also aware of these prejudices, and though he never became a Catholic and never had any serious interest in becoming a Catholic, Lewis did make a very sincere effort to get rid of the lingering anti-Catholic prejudices that he had brought over from childhood. And I think Tolkien occasionally blew up about these things, but he also always calmed down and realized, okay, yeah, Lewis he's doing his best. And so there were these tensions, but they were tensions that were in an acceptable balance, more or less.
I think their friendship was really beautiful in that sense, that they loved and respected each other so much that they recognized their differences, but they were still able to continue having a really wonderful friendship.
Yeah, and of course those differences did lead to certain tensions. I mean, most notably when Lewis married Joy, who was a divorcee, Tolkien was really gutted. I mean, he was really upset about this. And there, again, friendships are complicated. There's a lot of emotional stuff going on here. Tolkien was really hurt that Lewis had gotten married and not told him for a year.
Yeah.
And he found out.
I mean, that's fair.
Yeah, seriously. It's like he finds out about it a year later from a third person. Like, I understand that hurt. And actually, the fact that it didn't end their friendship says a lot about Tolkien's love for Lewis and his ability to forgive him, because that's a hard thing that he didn't tell him. But then when he has the Christian marriage with Joy, Tolkien was really worried because he thought it was an invalid marriage, because Joy being divorced and his understanding of marriage, like, they can't get married. She's already married. But of course, that's a tension, because in the Anglican Church, they don't have that understanding of marriage. And so literally in the Church of England, there was no vocabulary, no way to think about this, no way to deal with this, although Lewis himself kind of wrestled with it. So there's this tension. And of course, it must have made it hard for him to relate to Lewis, because, like, don't do this terrible thing. But again, it's coming out of love for him. But again, it didn't stop him from seeing his friend or interacting with him. He just worried about his friend, right? And I think, again, that's a beautiful testament to their friendship. And I think I don't know this for sure, but I'm sure that I'm confident that Tolkien heard eventually the fact that Joy's ex-husband had himself been married before he got married to Joy. So in that complicated chain of things, by the Catholic understanding, Joy's first marriage was not valid. And so, in fact, Joy was free in the Catholic understanding to marry Lewis. So considering how worried he was, I'm sure that he would have brought this up with the friends, and it would have eventually come to him. And then he would have said, oh, good. It's still a little crazy, but good. It's okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me just check and see what other questions we have. I know we got a couple last minute ones. Oh, this is a fun one. So this is kind of an anecdote that is brought up a lot, the bit about Tolkien responding to mass responses in Latin after the Vatican II. Is there anything maybe you could share a little bit about that to kind of contextualize it? Because you see it all, on Twitter, It's just a very commonly referred to story. So I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yes, I have a lot to say about that. And I'm really glad it came up because it is a story that goes around a lot and it is very much misconstrued. He was not, as far as I can see, protesting anything. That's a good starting point. So to contextualize, one of the things I learned when I was researching this book is that the shifting from what we might now call the traditional Latin Mass to the Novus Ordo took place in stages, and that these stages, we have to look very carefully at the chronology and what did Tolkien say about the Mass and what was going on at the time. So the first change was to take the Mass exactly as it was and just start to put it in English. They didn't put all of it in English right away. They put part of it in English, and then about 6 months later, they put the rest of it in English. But for that time period, it was the identical Latin Mass, but just in English. And that is what Tolkien is talking about for almost all of his references to the changes in the liturgy. Because we now call the Novus Ordo didn't come into effect until just a couple of years before he died. So almost all of what he's talking about the traditional Latin Mass translated into English. And what put me on the track for this was actually that very anecdote, because I had heard it presented as, oh, he was protesting the Novus Ordo by responding in Latin. Now, I go quite often to the extraordinary form, the traditional Latin Mass, when I'm in England, actually at St. Gregory and Augustine's, which is a church that Tolkien was a parishioner at for many years. And it struck me that there was a mismatch because the structure of the Mass is so different in the Novus Ordo that you can't just give the responses in Latin because the responses are in different places and they're different phrases. But it made a whole lot more sense when I realized that this has to do with the time period in which it was the identical Mass that he'd grown up with, but just in English. So the actual anecdote is with his grandson, Simon, who went to Mass with him and heard this and was embarrassed by it. His granddaughter, Joanna, also observed this and thought it was totally cool. So two different perspectives here. And looking at the date, it is in fact during the time when it's the traditional Latin Mass, but it just happens to be in Latin. That's why, in English now, that's why he's able to just give the responses in Latin, because it's the same responses in the same place. He would have been using a bilingual missal because that was what they were using at that point. So he's just naturally giving the responses that he has known all his life at that point in the liturgy. It's just natural to him. Was it possibly a little bit curmudgeonly? Like, I'm going to keep giving the responses the way I know them? Sure. Absolutely. I bet it was. The fact that it was a bit loud, I think, has to do with the fact that he was getting elderly and deaf, and so didn't know that he was being loud. And also Simon was embarrassed, so it sounded loud to him. But the key point here is that he wasn't trying to protest the Novus Ordo with this. And I want to elaborate a little bit more. There's a couple of interesting points. One is that we know that he really, really, really was sad that they took away the Latin. That's the thing that I really was able to determine in all of this. He actually didn't mind the change of the liturgy. It was the language that grieved him because he just loved the language. He knew Latin. He could speak it. He knew it better than the priest did, So he was unique in that respect. It was the language. And it didn't help that he really didn't like the English translations they were using. The translations were frankly, pretty lame, especially the sort of intermediary ones. I mean, he had a point. The translations were kind of lame. So it's more of a linguistic and aesthetic objection that he has. It's not an objection to the shift in the liturgy. And it's interesting with regard to some earlier changes in the 1950s, they revised the Holy Week liturgies massively, still in Latin, but very much restructured. And there's a letter that I quote in Tolkien's Faith that he says that it made him sad to lose the familiar liturgies, but he approved of them. He approved of the changes in principle. And he said that they were more suitable to the ways of life of modern Christians. So he's able to separate his own love of the familiar, liturgies with, well, there's a reason for these reforms, and I agree with the principle behind it. And then the last point, I really will then stop. There's the well-known so-called Agatha Christie indult, in which people made the petition to retain the saying of the Latin Mass in England. Tolkien didn't sign it. A lot of people think that he did, but he didn't. His name is not on there, even though several of his Inklings friends were on there.
Interesting.
Now, when I did the research for, Tolkien's faith, determined he did not sign it, but at that point, it was an open question for me whether did they just not ask him? Although he was such a prominent Catholic, surely they would have asked him. I mean, he was retired, but they knew where he was. Did he choose not? Did he just choose not to respond? And the extended letters that just have come out, I think, have answered that question, because in the extended letters, he says that he holds as a principle that whatever you might object to about the liturgy, and you might object to it privately, that he felt that it was appropriate publicly to be silent about it and not to make a controversy. So I think we can see that he chose as a matter of principle not to sign it, because he didn't think that was the appropriate thing to do. And then the end of his life, the last few years of his life, he chose to go to St. Anthony of Padua, where he went to a Novus Ordo Mass. So of his own free will. So a little bit more complicated. I know this is a very long answer.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Thank you for all of that, because I hadn't known very much of that. And I know there was a bit more about his faith in the new letters, but I haven't had a chance to read through all of them yet. So let's see, I might have one or two more questions and then we can wrap up, because it's getting a bit late. Let's see. Okay, this one is from Simon. He says, a question I have after reading chapter 5 is, did Tolkien use the Divine Office prayer books?
Good question. Not to my knowledge. That doesn't mean that he didn't. It means I don't have any evidence that he did. I did look into this question. It seems that at that time in England, that was more of a devotional practice for priests and religious, and not a typical religious practice for laymen. And I have had turned up no evidence that he did. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, Karl Hofstadter asked this question of Christopher Tolkien and got the answer that no, he didn't use the breviary. So I think that's.
Oh, wow. That answers that.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that bit.
That's great. All right. And our last question is just kind of more of a fun question. Texan Alex says, is she going to emulate Tolkien and shoot for a whole trilogy? What will the theme be of your next Tolkien book? So you've already got 2, so you need another one. Right.
Well, and yes, there will be more, and God willing, more even than 3. Why stop at 3? I am thinking about writing about Tolkien's vocation as a poet. That's something.
Oh, wow.
So, because his years in Leeds are really underappreciated. Everybody kind of focuses on when he turns up at Oxford. It's as if his life really properly begins. Like, there's the Great War that John Garth has done so much marvelous work with, and then there's Oxford. But John does a lot talking about his early poetry. But when he was in Leeds, in the 20s, he was really serious about his poetry. And he continued to write poetry, and it was important to him. And I'm interested in that. So, and there doesn't seem to be much about that biographically.
Sounds awesome. Yeah.
So I don't know. I need to not write any more books for a little while.
Need a break.
I do, but that's percolating. That's beginning to percolate.
That's very cool. Yeah, I'll look forward to that whenever you get a chance to. You need a little break first, but then whenever you get back to writing, I'm sure whatever it is will be awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know our Discord chat has been going crazy. They've been really enjoying this. And we've been really enjoying discussing your book. We'll be reading it for the rest of the month. And then we'll probably wrap it up and have our own little chat about it. But this was really nice of you to come on and talk about it and answer everyone's questions. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And honestly, as a writer, what could be better than to have like a whole group of people who are like reading your book and talking about it and having interesting questions about it. It's just marvelous. So very encouraging for me as a writer to know that they're interested readers. So thank you, all of you folks.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, we'll let you go now because I know I'm not sure what time zone you're in, but it's getting pretty late in mine.
All right. Well, good night,
All right,
all.
thanks. Bye.